Well, my name is Dana Morgan, and I spent close to 50 years in the amusement park business, both in the manufacturing side and in the operating side. Well, my father, Ed Morgan, was one of the founders, so I was only 1 year old when the company was founded, so I don't remember those days, but I grew up around there, and then I worked there for a number of years later on. And I was actually president of the company when it was Aero, so I have a long history with that company. Well, in those days, the working age was when I was about 10, I think. I would go out on installations with them, and a lot of what we did in those days was carousels, and so I would go along to set up carousels, again, from the time I was about 10 years old. By the time I was 12, I could put a carousel up. I mean, I'd have to have physical help, but I knew how to put a carousel together by the time I was 12 years old, or to take one down and move it somewhere else, just because I learned it from the very beginning. And then when I was 14, Aero owned a little amusement park in Palo Alto at Town and Country Village. And I worked there first as a ride operator, and then by the time I was 15, I was the mechanical maintenance guy for that park. And then later, I worked in the factory, like when I was in school, I worked summers as a forklift operator, and then later, after when I graduated from college, I went to work for Disney for a while at Disneyland in the engineering department. And then I went back to Aero in the engineering department in the late 60s, and then I ran the prototype shop, I ran the assembly shops and various different shops until I left in 74 and went to the Boardwalk. In Santa Cruz, I became general manager there, and then I went back in 81 when, and I helped negotiate the purchase by the Hoos Group of the company from the Denver Rio Grande Railroad, and then I was president of the company for a short time then. One of the things that sticks in my mind is that the original plant in Mountain View, the way that they got the building is that they were able to purchase the land, but they didn't have enough money to build the building. So they found a guy who wanted to go into the business of making cinder blocks for buildings. Again, this is right after World War II, and everybody's just trying to get started. But that guy also was undercapitalized. So they poured a little concrete slab and had just one electrical outlet, and they owned one welding machine. And so on the concrete slab outside, they fabricated the molds for the concrete blocks. And of course, my dad and Carl and the other guys who were involved then were always very creative, and they came up with a better way to make the molds than they'd been done before. And they traded, so the guy then took the molds and made all the blocks for their building in trade. So they didn't get paid for it, got him started, got them started, and they built the building themselves then using those blocks. So that's, I mean, they started with, let's say, very little capitalization. There were no venture capitalists in those days. Well, and they actually had built, the four partners, they actually built houses for each of them at the same time, because that was the way that they could get started so that they didn't have big house payments. So they built 4 houses and the shop, and in the very early days of the company.
Bob Gurr told us at when he was here recently about you working on an antique car with your dad at the garage. Do you remember anything about that?
I think that what he's thinking about, I had an antique car that I was restoring at the second plant, and I was a little too young at the first plant to be doing that myself, I think, but I did at the second plant, and we had a fire in the fiberglass shop there while I was down at Cal Poly, and the car was damaged quite a bit by that. And I think that's the one he's remembering. But I absolutely remember Bob Gurr at that other plant, and the day that he designed the body for the Aero freeway car. And I was, like in high school at that time, and I remember spending the day watching him. It's just amazing to watch that process. And I can remember that like it was yesterday. I don't know that I have a favorite. I mean, there are several times. The first thing that I remember that was fairly memorable was the test of the Casey Jr. train for Disney, and then later the initial Matterhorn test, and that at the original plants. And then at the second plant, probably the biggest milestone there was when we ran the Corkscrew for the first time.
Talk about that moment at running Corkscrew for the very first time. Not knowing, well, you knew it was going to work, but did you still have those doubts?
Well, I was the first one to ride it, and the Norm Scott and I. So what we did is that we had run it a couple times, but we didn't have a complete track, and so you had to pull it backwards up the lift, up a reverse lift, if you will. And so I had taken the competition seat belts out of my race car and put them in because we had not yet developed the over-the-shoulder restraint. We were still working on that. So we put the comp seat belts in it, and Carl was kind of nervous for anybody to ride it, and so finally I said, okay, Carl, here's what we're going to do. We took a tire from one of the freeway cars and we set it in the seat, and Carl and I stood underneath and we ran it once and we watched, and it didn't come out. And we could see it when it went over that it would just move a little bit in the seat, so we're like, okay, it looks like it's pretty much zero gravity. So Carl's like, okay, you can ride it. So Norma and I got in, strapped ourselves into it, we pulled it backwards up this lift, and we had what's called a pelican hook to release it, and it jammed and it wouldn't release. So we're hanging there in the restraints. So I loosened my restraints up so that I could get around to look to see what was going on. And of course, right when I got hanging way over the side, it let loose. And I turned around pretty quickly and pulled the restraints down. And I can remember like it was yesterday because it looked at the warehouse, and the sensation was that the warehouse turned over twice. I mean, we never felt being upside down really. But of course, then we came to, there was kind of a break, and then there was a pile of sandbags that we ran into to stop it. So we only rode it a couple times like that, and then after that, we went ahead and put the rest of the system in. But that was a fantastic experience to be the first one to do that.
Talk about your first ride on the Matterhorn then, before it was finished.
Well, the first was the test track, when there were two test tracks, when Disney had one in Southern California and Aero had one in the yard up here. And I rode that test track. I was pretty young. I can't say I have a vivid memory of that. I remember riding that. And then when the ride itself was finished, I think that I was the first kid to ride on the ride. I wasn't the first person, certainly, but I was there, with my dad, and I rode on it before it was open to the public. But there might be somebody else out there that's going to claim they rode it before me. But I think I was the first kid to ride the Matterhorn.
When did you first visit Disneyland, and what does it mean to you that parts of your family's legacy still live on today there?
Well, my first time at Disneyland was opening day, and my dad had been there quite a bit before that, and Carl, but we were there, the family was there for opening day. And then I've been there, many, many times since. I think that the legacy thing is, there's a huge satisfaction for all of us that were involved. The thing about Aero is that, there were key players, and the same with Disney, there were key players, but there was a whole team of people that made that all happen. And I think that satisfaction of seeing things that are still operating today, and having been part of the creative team that did them, and our family having been part of that, it's just a very satisfying thing.
Did you ever meet Walt Disney?
Well, several times, yeah. The first time I met him, I think, was probably the Casey Jr. test. And we had a test track set up in the yard to prove, because they wanted it to go up a pretty steep hill, and there was a lot of people thought that couldn't be done. And so I remember when he came to do that, and I believe that's the first time I met him. And then, of course, again for the Matterhorn test, and he wanted to, he knew, I didn't know him super well, but I knew him, and he wanted to see a kid ride it, and so I was the test dummy while he watched that. And then there was another time that he came up to look at the antique car, and Aero had built a little Model T Ford test, and it was the first time with the center limiting guide system. But this was a gas engine car, and so they had it set up in the yard behind the original factory there, and actually not in the yard, but we're out on the street. And so I was elected to be the test driver. And I went down the street and back around, and I was doing just fine. And then I made a turn, and I realized I hadn't really turned sharp enough because it had a pretty big turning radius. And so then I kind of turned back, and now I'm going towards the curb, and there was a big high curb. And they had developed the system that's still used with a single pedal. You let your foot off to stop, and you push down to go. Well, I'm going at the curb now, and I actually did know how to drive, even though I wasn't old enough. And so my reaction was to push on that brake pedal, because it was a nice round, it was a 32 Ford brake pedal is what it was. And I pushed down nice and hard on it and ran straight into the curb, and the front axle was two pieces of aluminum heated arc together, and it broke and went boonk onto the ground like that. And my father obviously was not particularly happy with me over that. And I can remember Walt Disney came over and gave me a little pat and said, "It's okay." You know? So.
Why, we'll kind of go more to a bit of the coaster stuff now.
Sure.
Why is tubular steel so important or integral to steel coaster design 50 to 60 years after it was first pioneered by your dad?
Well, I think that it's just the natural medium. I mean, the basic thing about the round pipe rail is that we can roll it flat and we can rotate it into position. Anything other than round, you have to, when you form it, you have to be axis specific. You have to get it correct. And so any kind of square or rectangular or any other kind of steel, it's very difficult to achieve that. With the round rail, you roll it flat and you put it in position. And then in later years, where we became skilled with the computers, we could build the track in a completely different orientation. So we could take a track section that would be going uphill and turning, and we could build it on its side. And the guys in the shop wouldn't even necessarily have to know where it was going to go eventually. They were given a set of coordinates that worked. So that ability to roll it flat is just hard to beat as an element.
Why did Aero ultimately not make it? Why are they not around today?
Well, I think that during the days that the Denver Rio Grande Railroad or Rio Grande Industries owned them, they were really good guys and they really meant well, but they didn't understand that that creative company never had a budget, never had a return on investment plan. We would simply, the Corkscrew is a good example. Carl Bacon came out to the prototype shop and said, "Would you guys set me up with like a 24-inch piece of steel tube on a couple of sawhorses about 8 feet long?" We're like, "Okay," nobody knows what he's doing, you know. And then after a while, he's like, "Can I have Pete work with me for a couple of days?" And he made this big helix. And then at lunchtime one day, he walks in and puts it on the lunch table and says, "I think this could be a roller coaster." And we're all looking at it going, "What is that?" You know. And then he says, "Well, no, this is the Corkscrew." Well, I walked around the end of the table and I looked and I said, "There's an incredible TV shot there looking up that thing. That thing's going to be immensely marketable, not just as a ride experience, but a marketing thing." So next thing, we built a little bit bigger model, no budget or anything. Somewhere along the line, Walter Schultz, who was in charge of the finances of the company, he'd say, "Guys, what's that going to cost to go to that next stage?" And they go, "I don't really know." And he'd go, "Well, okay, well," he'd put some money aside. And he never would say, I want you to tell me how much money we're going to make with it or anything. So we built a bigger model. And that worked pretty cool, and we looked at it. And so then we built the full-size one, and we wrote it. But there was never a budget for any of that. We did it, and we're like, "This thing's so cool, now we got to make it the rest of the way." Well, we sold 6 of them almost immediately. It was a huge financial success. After the company sold, then it was managed by financial people. And they were always like, "Well, you have to show us how many of these can you guarantee you're going to sell, and what's it going to cost to develop it." And we were still the same way. We're like, "We don't know. We just make cool stuff. You know, we know." And they'd say, "Well, are you sure you can make it work?" We'd say, "No, we got these 3 ideas. We want to work on all 3 of them, and we probably can make at least one of them work." But we couldn't tell them. Sometimes none of them worked. And so during that time, they rejected, for example, we had the concept early on for a river ride like Intamin built so many of, and they rejected that. They didn't let us pursue it. So Aero never built that ride. We were first with that. My dad developed the swinging ship like the pirate ships, and they wouldn't let us move forward with that because they didn't think there was any future in that. So it was just good guys who didn't understand creative people, and creative people who didn't have any idea how to make a budget or anything, and just knew how to make cool stuff. And it worked when they were in charge, and we just made cool stuff and people bought it. I don't know that I really have a favorite. For me, always, and when I've been asked this question before, my answer always was the next one, because if you're involved in building it, you're always looking down the road. It's tremendously satisfying to build them. It's fun kind of up to the day you turn it over to the park, because the first ride in the park and everything. And after that, you're done with them, if that's the side of it that you do. So, there was many wonderful rides that we built, but it was always that next one that was exciting for us.
Do you have any prized possessions in the family archives relating to the company? And if so, tell the listeners and the viewers about it.
Well, fortunately, yeah, we did keep some stuff. It was kind of interesting because during the time that Aero was going forward, we didn't save a lot of stuff because nobody really thought of it as being anything for the future. Again, we were always busy on the next thing. I mean, we'd finish one and we'd have to get right on it. But there are a couple of fun things. This is from the 25th anniversary of the company, so this is a long time ago. I think the date's on there in 1970. The Disney guys sent this, and so if you'll look and read on there, there's many famous Disney Imagineers and Disney management people, including Roy O. Disney, that signed this, and fortunately we had retained that, so that's neat to have. And then we have my dad's Hall of Fame award there, which is very, very special to us. So and then the other thing that we have, which we can unroll later, is we've got a copy of the original plans for the Matterhorn with Walt Disney's signature on it, and a comment that I'll show you.
What do you think is the ultimate legacy of aero development and aerodynamics?
I think that there was a phrase that my father used to use that he didn't invent, but he said that the quality is remembered long after the price is forgotten. And I think that a lot of what Aero did, they were never the cheap guy. Their stuff, and the same with Morgan Manufacturing, we were never the least expensive manufacturer, but we always tried very hard to have the highest quality. And I think that that what a lot of the parks learned from that is that buying the really fine, high quality piece of equipment was in fact the right thing to do, and buying cheap stuff didn't work. Yeah, I mean, I spent some time over there with Vekoma on that. That deal was working during the time that it was initiated, but then when the company was sold again, there were issues with that, and it wasn't. Vekoma went through some changes. Hoopen lost control of the company during that time, and so there were some unethical things that occurred there. So the original relationship seemed to work fairly well, but again, there were just some unethical things that occurred later on that caused it to be a problem. I don't know that I think that the operating industry learned that much from Aero. I think that it was during that time that was so creative, and there were so many people on the operating side that were equally good and equally creative, and so it was just a time that where the whole industry came of age, if you will. And again, both on the operating side and the manufacturing side, we were all making it up as we went. There were no formulas, and so many of the things that were very, very successful were just done because both groups of people thought it'd be cool, and just were like, I can remember many, many meetings with all the different groups where everybody just said, yeah, let's try that. Let's just see if we can make that work. And I think that willingness to just do that is maybe what was the most important. I was working as the president of Aero Hoos, and Klaus Hoos and I had a difference of opinion. We had 2 or 3 differences of opinion, and we're still friends today, but so that caused us to have a parting of the ways. And so initially, my wife Paula and I decided to start a manufacturing company, and our plan really was only to do carousels. We enjoyed doing the carousels, and I was kind of tired of going all over the world on these projects and stuff, and we were looking for a lower key thing. But the initial building that we leased belonged to Charles Canfield, my good friend. And so Charles was like, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, we're going to build carousels. And But the reality was nobody had bought a carousel yet. And Charles was like, I really need you to make new cars for the Giant Dipper for me. And so we're like, oh yeah, we can do that. My father had designed the ones that were on it. They'd been built by Aero, but they were my dad's design. And so we went and got the spare one, and we redesigned it a bit and built those for him. Well, next thing we know, we're back in the coaster business, because we went to the trade show that next year, and so we took some carousel animals and things hoping to sell carousels, and then we took one of Charles's cars with us to the trade show just to have something else to show that we could actually build something. And we didn't realize that there was a demand for a new kind of vehicle for the wood coasters. So I think we sold 2 or 3 coaster trains and no carousels. So we were back in the coaster business. And then even later, we were doing more specialty kinds of rides, but then friends in the industry started coming to us and saying, hey, would you guys consider building a steel coaster? And by then Steve Okamoto had joined us, and Steve's a tremendously gifted coaster designer. And so we decided to start building steel coasters again. And that never was the original plan, but we built some really great steel coasters.
And then talk about your renovation of an Aero ride at Kennywood from Steel Phantom to Phantom's Revenge.
Yeah, that was an interesting project. They asked us to come in and take a look at that and make a dramatic change in that ride, and we did. And yeah, I was very satisfied with the way that came out. I think that was a very successful project. And we sort of integrated the 2 different styles of track construction, because we had developed what I would consider to be a slightly more sophisticated method to build the track, and primarily because of the use of the computers and the 3D modeling. In the old days at Aero, we always built the track in the correct orientation that it was going to be in the final world, not at the same elevation necessarily, but we always built it, if you will, right side up. But with 3D modeling, we were able to give the shop a model where the track would be, instead of in the configuration it was going to be in, would be as close to the ground as possible to build it. And then we developed the segmented backbone, where we could computer model the cuts, because each piece of backbone has an angle on one end and then another angle on the other end that are not oriented the same. But we had a way to predict that, and then we built our own machine to make those. And so that technique allowed us to make extremely accurate track.
What, in your opinion, makes the themed entertainment or amusement industry so special to so many people?
Well, I think it's an escape from everyday reality to some degree, but I think for all of us that worked in the business, it's just the creativity. It's an incredible group of really creative people that just come together on a project basis and make really cool stuff. And it's just, that's more important to all of us that build the stuff than any other portion of it is. It's the chance to create and build really unusual stuff. And it's really satisfying to all of us that then other people get so much pleasure out of experiencing those things.